All right, so acquisition of TubeMogul announced this morning for $540 million. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Very excited.
So we're gonna throw out this script and only talk about TubeMogul. Just kidding. So because of SEC regulations, Taylor cannot comment on the acquisition other than saying thank you. So that's a future conversation. One thing, so we just heard from Laura. I gave some comments as well, and one of the things that we really try to figure out is what is the difference among the marketing clouds?
Okay.
Obviously, you're in that every day. So how do you guys view it as far as like, what you're trying to do with your marketing cloud in order to, differentiate in the industry?
I think actually what you just said there is the most important thing, which is what are you trying to do? I remember I got to Yahoo, and it was one of my prior lives, and I see a number of friends and friendly faces from prior lives. We would get these calls, and it was so-and-so says that Google is looking to buy this company, and people start freaking out. And I sort of looked at people and said, so, what does that have to do with what our strategy is? Let's figure out what our strategy is and go from there. And so we really sort of got focused on that. And I think the Adobe culture is very much that. We're a product-centric culture. We start with the product and sort of how do you build that forward. I think, frankly, there's a lot we agree on in terms of how Laura sort of portrayed her perspective on the market. In the marketing cloud, this may even go back to your days and predate the Adobe with Omniture, but there's been this point of view for a long time around the last millisecond. How do you bring data and content and delivery together in real time? And I think over the last few years, we've begun to realize that as the world goes digital, that moves way beyond just marketing. And so marketing is kind of the tip of the spear, and in many ways, the first place that went digital. But customers are trying to get in touch with their customers and sort of cut out the middleman and use digital to do that. So we have customers like Starwoods that use us for their mobile app, and you can book a room, you can check in. They've got a few properties where they've actually redone the doors, and you can go use that as your key to get in. And I'm not sure that's marketing. I'm not sure that's sales. It's a little bit of support, but it's basically the experience, right, is part of that. And so that digital, experience that touches the customer is what we hear our customers talking about. They're constantly afraid, excited about this concept of digital transformation, and folks around the corner like Andreessen that like to talk about software eating the world, and there's this sort of subtext of startups are going to come crush you, which is good for all of us here in the Valley, but obviously has different repercussions out in the broader world. We've seen the fact that none of them are standing still, and they want a partner to help figure out digital, and it's well beyond marketing. So marketing for us is central, but more and more of the last year, we've been thinking of the marketing cloud as kind of the first step towards this experience business.
Makes a ton of sense, and that is absolutely something we see in the industry. The customer experience and optimizing that experience is something that's critical, and a lot of the enabling technologies can start with marketing and be utilized across the organization. So you run not just M&A, but also strategy and strategic partnerships as well. So like back in the Omniture days, one of the things that was hugely successful was our Genesis Partner Program. So as you're going through developing your strategy and deciding what to do, how do you think about, what are you going to buy versus build versus partner? And how do you, since there's a lot of CEOs here that, are either Adobe partners or would like to be, how do they think about that?
Again, we're a product-centric company, so frankly, the bias is to start with build, and then you sort of look at what else is out there in the market. I think as our ambitions have expanded, particularly beyond marketing, any illusions you have that you can sort of build an end-to-end app are gone. We need to become a platform, and we're using our partner programs and pushing much harder in that direction. So I think a lot of companies that start with that product heritage and have engineering at their heart, struggle with NIH and, I can do that. We're no different in some ways. You certainly have had those conversations with people, but I would say it's not a question of can we build it. When you have thousands and thousands of engineers, you can build anything. The question is that the right place you should focus? And if there's innovative companies out in the market that are doing great things, you should frankly start with partnering whenever possible, because that allows you to sort of prove that what you're doing adds value in the market. And then if you ever get to the point of deciding it makes more sense to do it together and sort of become one company, that piece of the puzzle is already figured out. So we're kind of doubling down. We've moved on from the Genesis program and are focusing in on something we're calling Adobe Exchange, built on top of the Marketing Cloud data platform, and trying to sort of open up what we're doing to a broader set of companies going forward.
Great. And so before Adobe, you were at Zynga, before Zynga at Yahoo, and I see James Barrick in the crowd. So Taylor was associated with the first Luma deal, was the acquisition of Dapper, led by James. So it's nice to kind of close the loop here. So you've obviously interacted with a lot of startups and startup CEOs, which dominate the room here. What are, from your perspective, what are the lessons learned, what to do, what not to do for a startup CEO interacting with corporate development at a large company?
Well, one thing is interact. I view this as a fundamentally collaborative exercise. I mean, we're not just trying to go, bang out deals and whatnot. We are a growth function, and our goal is to help Adobe grow faster than it would otherwise. And so to do that, you have to have an understanding of the market, and it has to be two-way discussion. I think sometimes people view corporate development as this distraction you don't want to deal with until you're absolutely ready to go sell your company. And in my experience, that's a bad way to do that. Sometimes if you are phenomenally successful and have a ton of momentum and people just sort of know about you and your customers and your products are so entrenched, again, where products are integrated, you can get away with maybe less interaction over time. But I love Mark Suster, VC, wrote a blog post a couple years ago called "He Invests in Lines, Not Dots," and that really resonated with me. The concept being, if you meet someone once, that's a dot. And if you come back and meet a couple more times, next thing you know, you have a line. And you can sort of connect the dots and have a perspective on where they've been, where they're coming, where they've come from, where they're going, and why they went there. And so your ability to get confidence in the accelerated fashion of doing a deal and sort of putting that together goes up dramatically. And so I think that alone is a big thing. And you hear in the Valley sometimes, particularly some of the incubators and stuff will tell their companies not to talk to corp dev. And I think for those super early, sort of inexperienced entrepreneurs who are just trying to get a product out the door, I get that. But everyone in this room has a real business and something going on. And I think the ones that I respect the most are the ones who sort of keep a pulse and just keep a dialogue with no real agenda. It's just like, hey, let's grab coffee for 30 minutes. I want to catch up and let you know what we're doing. And frankly, being very open. And that would probably be the last thing, is what not to do. Again, it's probably less true for a group like this that's been really experienced. But I've seen some of, particularly when I was at Yahoo, and you had some of the consumer-focused founders who maybe it was their first company and whatnot. They would sometimes get into this world and it felt very stiff and rigid, and they would start to posture and position. And when you've done this long enough, you can see right through that. And it's much better to be just open, authentic, and remember that you should be evaluating us just as much as we're evaluating you. Because I always say at the end of the day, yes, there are founders that move on day one, but most of the time founders stick around for some period of time. Maybe that's, frankly at Adobe, we have people who stay, 5-10 years, but some people, the more norm across the Valley is probably a couple years. But a couple years is a long time of your life. So you want to make sure it's a place you want to work, where you identify with the values, you identify with the mission, and hopefully the combination is a bigger mission than you started with.
Yeah, that's very consistent with the advice we always give to the CEOs that say, how do I interact with these guys? Is, sometimes you'll hear, I'm just going to keep my heads down and build a great business, and great companies are bought, not sold. We agree with that philosophy. However, you need to also foster relationships with the logical partners, which are also the logical buyers in the space. So making sure you understand who those strategic companies are, and you could create terrific commercial relationships with those companies that over time could lead to even something deeper. So agree 100%.
Yeah, I mean, to me, you should know who your likely buyer universe is, and you should have relationships at those companies well before. And so it's one of those things where when you invest ahead of the curve, then you have a perspective, and you should probably have a relationship in corp dev, and you should have a relationship in the business unit or product org that is relevant to you. You see, smaller companies kind of go all in on partnerships and trying to get the one big company partnership that's going to change their business. We all know those rarely pan out as planned, but smart, strategic integrations that sort of add value for customers, make all the sense in the world.
And I'm always curious, since the great company's bought, not sold. So, we are witnessing, massive amounts of sell-side processes going on as well. And just curious, how many do you see in a week, month, year, however you track it?
We've had days where we had 10 in a single day in the last month, right? The inbounds, I think particularly the last year, as the VC markets tightened up, and so people, even if they feel confident they're going to be on the right side of that equation, they realize that everything's going to the moon era that we lived through for the last few years has changed, and so being pragmatic, they want to kind of think about if they're going to take the money, is it worth it? Do they believe they're going to get the return by going and continuing on the journey for another few years? So people are frankly testing the market more. In the spring we had the pullback in SaaS that certainly put a bunch of things in play. Markets were back, and so it's been an interesting environment where that comes through. So it's hard to put an exact number, but 50 in a week is not unheard of.
Yeah, and out of the percentages of deals, how many of those are done kind of reactively versus the proactive?
So I always try to draw a line between what I call responsive and reactive. Reactive is we had no idea in the space, we had no idea in the company, we get a call from a banker and we're like, okay, we'll take a meeting. You have to be open-minded and sort of admit that there's no such thing as perfect coverage and perfect understanding of the market. And so, things do get done in that world, but they're much higher bar because your level of comfort of investing in a dot is very different than investing in a line. Yep. Responsive is different. Responsive is sort of the exception to the bought, not sold, which is the company, the space, you like them, you sort of have some interest, you think it could be interesting, and the timing is predicated by a funding event or the fact that someone else has put them in play. We try hard to be thoughtful and responsive and not be reactive unless it really is justified.
Yep. So last question. So way before Adobe started your career as a professional soccer player. So I'm curious.
You're going there, huh?
I'm curious. How do you go from being a professional soccer player to technology strategist?
Luck. I definitely wouldn't sort of chart my career path. I did a lot of things backwards. I showed up at the doorstep of an enterprise software company in 1996 that was down in San Diego, of all things, 150 employees. It was effectively the forerunner to ServiceNow. Our CTO ended up leaving and founding ServiceNow. And basically said, look, I've got some life experience. I'm willing to work hard. I don't care what you pay me as long as you take care of me if I do a good job. And I always say it was probably the last thing that, was the hook that got me in. And I just loved it. I started sort of reading voraciously, working 16-hour days, not because I didn't have enough responsibilities to have 16-hour days, but I was just trying to figure out what the heck the technology did. And I just sort of learned it was a language that you could pick up like, Dutch, like I did when I played in Holland, and you just needed to dig in. And I think the thing I've loved about being in sort of software and internet is that if we can dream it, some engineer can probably make it happen. There are laws of physics in smart grids and whatnot that Laura talked about, and we're pushing the boundaries of those with AI and everything. But what happens here is really literally changing the world.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I started my career not nearly as cool as a professional soccer player, as a mechanical engineer in oil and gas. So my career has deviated as well. So, all right.
We'll give career planning advice later.
Very good. Thank you so much, Taylor.
Thank you.